Margaret adjusted the brim of her wide-brimmed hat, shielding her eyes from the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy of ancient oaks. The woods were her sanctuary, a place where the weight of her 63 years seemed to lift, if only for a moment. Here, among the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a distant bird, she could forget the quiet monotony of her life, a life that had become little more than a series of predictable routines. Her husband, Harold, was a good man, but their marriage had settled into a comfortable, if unremarkable, rhythm. He spent his days tinkering in the garage or engrossed in the evening news, while Margaret filled her hours with gardening, reading, and these solitary walks. They rarely spoke of anything beyond the mundane: the weather, the grocery list, the occasional update from their grown children. It wasn't that Harold was unkind. He simply didn't see her, not the way she longed to be seen. Today, however, the woods felt different. The air was charged with an energy she couldn't quite place. She paused at the edge of a clearing, her breath catching as a loud, resonant voice broke the silence. It was a man's voice, deep and commanding, echoing through the trees. Curiosity tugged at her, and she followed the sound, her sensible walking shoes crunching softly against the forest floor. She found him in a small glade, bathed in a shaft of golden light. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark skin glistening with sweat as he moved with the grace of someone much younger. His athletic build was accentuated by the fitted tank top and shorts he wore, and his voice carried a passion that made Margaret's heart skip a beat. He was practicing a speech, his words flowing with an intensity that held her captive. "You are more than your past," he declared, his voice rising. "You are more than the mistakes you've made, the pain you've endured. You are capable of greatness, if only you believe it." Margaret stood frozen, her cheeks flushing as she realized she was intruding. She turned to leave, but a twig snapped beneath her foot, and his head snapped in her direction. "Hey there," he called, his tone shifting from fiery to friendly. "Didn't mean to scare you." Margaret hesitated, then stepped into the clearing. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I just heard you and wanted to see who was out here." He smiled, a warm, disarming grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "No need to apologize. I'm James," he said, extending a hand. "Margaret," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, and she felt a strange flutter in her chest. "So, Margaret," James said, tilting his head, "what brings you out here? You don't strike me as the type to wander the woods alone." She laughed, a sound that surprised even herself. "I could say the same about you. What are you doing out here, shouting at the trees?" He chuckled, a rich, melodic sound that made her smile. "I'm a fitness trainer, but I also run motivational workshops. I like to practice my speeches where no one can judge me, except the squirrels, of course." They fell into an easy conversation, talking about their lives, their passions, and their struggles. James was 38, a decade younger than her youngest child, but his maturity and insight made the age difference feel irrelevant. He spoke of his dreams with a fervor that Margaret found both inspiring and intoxicating. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, James glanced at his watch. "I should probably head back," he said, though his tone suggested reluctance. "But it was really nice meeting you, Margaret. Maybe we'll run into each other again." "I'd like that," she replied, surprising herself with her honesty. He smiled again, that same warm, disarming smile, and turned to leave. Margaret watched him go, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. She felt alive, seen, and for the first time in a long while, hopeful. But as she made her way home, the guilt began to creep in. She thought of Harold, of the life they had built together, and wondered what she was doing. James was just a stranger, a fleeting connection in the woods. Yet, as she stepped through her front door and greeted Harold with a perfunctory kiss, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something she wasn't sure she could control. The chapter ends with Margaret sitting alone in her kitchen, staring at the steam rising from her cup of tea. The woods had always been her escape, but now they held a secret, one that threatened to unravel the life she had always known. Margaret woke to the sound of Harold's steady snoring, the rhythmic noise a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within her. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the encounter with James in the woods. His words, his smile, the way he had looked at her. It all lingered like a melody she couldn't forget. She glanced at the clock. 6:15 a.m. Harold would sleep for another hour, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in her heart. She slipped out of bed, dressed quietly, and tiptoed downstairs. The house was still, the early morning light casting long shadows across the kitchen. She made a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred in a spoonful of honey. The woods called to her, a siren song she couldn't resist. By the time she reached the glade, the sun had risen higher, painting the trees in hues of gold and green. James was already there, stretching near a fallen log. He looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a smile that made her stomach flutter. "Margaret," he said, his voice warm and inviting. "I was hoping I'd see you again." "I couldn't stay away," she admitted, her cheeks flushing. "Your energy is contagious." They began walking together, the conversation flowing as easily as it had the day before. James spoke of his work, his passion for helping others find their strength, and his love for the outdoors. Margaret found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years, sharing stories of her teaching career, her children, and the quiet loneliness that had settled over her life. "You're incredible, you know that?" James said, stopping to look at her. "The way you've raised a family, built a life, it's inspiring." Margaret shook her head, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. "It doesn't feel inspiring. Most days it just feels empty." James reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She pulled away, her heart racing. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his expression earnest. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," she replied, though her voice wavered. "It's just complicated." They continued walking in silence for a while, the tension between them palpable. Margaret's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, desire, fear. She knew she was treading on dangerous ground, yet the thought of turning back felt unbearable. As they reached a small stream, James knelt to splash water on his face. Margaret watched him, her chest tightening with a mix of admiration and longing. He stood, water droplets glistening on his skin, and turned to her. "Margaret," he said softly, "I know this is unconventional, but I feel something when I'm with you. Something real." Her breath caught, and she looked away, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "James, I'm married. I have a life, a husband who loves me in his own way. This, whatever this is, it's not fair to him. Or to you." James stepped closer, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. "I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give, but I think you deserve to feel alive, to be seen. And if I can help you feel that, even for a moment, then it's worth it to me." Margaret's resolve wavered, the walls she had built around her heart crumbling under the weight of his words. She wanted to believe him, to let herself be swept away by the promise of passion and connection. But the guilt was a heavy anchor, pulling her back to reality. "I need to go," she said abruptly, her voice trembling. "Harold will be wondering where I am." James nodded, though his eyes betrayed his disappointment. "I understand. But Margaret, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'll be here." She turned and hurried away, her heart pounding in her chest. The walk home felt longer than usual, each step weighed down by the weight of her conflicting emotions. When she finally reached her house, Harold was in the kitchen, frying eggs and humming tunelessly. "Morning, dear," he said, glancing up briefly. "You're up early." "Just needed some fresh air," she replied, forcing a smile. Harold nodded, his attention already back on the stove. Margaret sat at the table, her tea growing cold as she stared out the window. The woods loomed in the distance, a symbol of both escape and temptation. She thought of James, of the way he had looked at her, the way he had made her feel. For the first time in years, she had felt seen, valued, desired. But at what cost? The chapter ends with Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around the cooling mug of tea. The woods had given her a glimpse of something she hadn't realized she was missing, but now she was left to grapple with the consequences. The line between right and wrong had blurred, and she wasn't sure which side she stood on anymore. Margaret sat at the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. Harold was in the living room, engrossed in a documentary about World War II. His occasional murmurs of interest drifting through the open door. She should have been content in this moment of domestic tranquility, but her mind was elsewhere, back in the woods, back with James. The guilt had become a constant companion, gnawing at her conscience with relentless persistence. She had avoided the woods for days, telling herself it was the right thing to do. But the memory of James's smile, his words, his touch, lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. She felt torn between the life she had built and the possibility of something more, something she hadn't dared to dream of in years. Finally, unable to bear the weight of her indecision any longer, Margaret slipped on her coat and stepped outside. The evening air was cool, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. She walked briskly, her breath visible in the crisp air, until she reached the edge of the woods. James was there, as if he had been waiting for her. He stood beneath the canopy of trees, his hands in his pockets, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. When he saw her, his face lit up, but he didn't rush to close the distance between them. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said softly. "I wasn't sure I would either," Margaret admitted, her voice trembling. "But I needed to see you. To talk." They walked together, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Finally, James broke the stillness. "Margaret, I know this isn't easy for you, and I don't want to make things harder. But I can't pretend that what I feel for you isn't real." She stopped, turning to face him. "James, I'm married. I made vows, promises. This, whatever this is. It's not fair to Harold. Or to you." James reached out, his hand hovering near hers before he pulled it back. "I'm not asking you to choose. I just want you to know that you deserve to be happy. And if being with me, even for a little while, makes you happy, then I'm here." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, her heart aching with the weight of his words. She wanted to believe him, to let herself be swept away by the promise of passion and connection. But the guilt was a heavy anchor, pulling her back to reality. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't do this to Harold. He's a good man and he doesn't deserve this." James nodded, his expression somber. "I understand, and I respect your decision. But Margaret, if you ever change your mind, I'll be here." She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she turned and walked away. The woods felt different now, the once familiar paths foreign and unwelcoming. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and the weight of that knowledge was almost too much to bear. When she returned home, Harold was still in the living room, the documentary now replaced by a late-night talk show. He looked up as she entered, his expression one of mild curiosity. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual. "Yes," Margaret replied, forcing a smile. "Just needed some fresh air." Harold nodded, his attention already back on the TV. Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. He was a good man, kind and steady, and she loved him in her own way. But the connection she had felt with James was something entirely different, something she hadn't realized she was missing until it was too late. She climbed the stairs to their bedroom, her steps heavy with exhaustion. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she thought of James, of the life they might have had if things were different. But the reality was that she had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. The chapter ends with Margaret lying in bed, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. The woods had given her a glimpse of something she hadn't realized she was missing, but now she was left to grapple with the consequences. The line between right and wrong had blurred, and she wasn't sure which side she stood on anymore.